So what we might have here is a procreational Ponzi scheme, that you're trying to have the meaning, create the meaning of future generations. So you create another generation in order to do that. But in order for them to keep themselves going, they need to produce another generation and then another generation. But eventually, as with all Ponzi schemes, this is going to go bust.
David Benatar is a South African philosopher, academic and author. He's the head of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town. He's also the author of a number of books, including Better to Never Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, and The Human Predicament, A Candid Guide to Life's Biggest Questions. On a side note, the creation of the main character of the TV show True Detective, Rust Cohle, was heavily influenced by the philosophy of antinatalism. In this episode, we talk with David about antinatalism, the concept and philosophy which postulates that coming into existence at all causes serious harm and inevitably leads to suffering, and how, as a consequence, it is morally wrong to create more sentient beings. Although this is a podcast about death, we hope by now you know how much we love life. So, of course, this doesn't fit in with David's antinatalist philosophy of ceasing procreation. This, in turn, leaves us with a very healthy debate, and we'd love to know your views after watching. So please leave a comment or email us with your thoughts. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com. It would also be a massive help to us if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, which you can do right now by simply clicking on the subscribe button. So, settle in for this episode, the inspiration for True Detective's Rust Cohle.
There's one thing about our show, David. We try to bring humor in our show. Despite talking about death, we try to be very humoristic. I was checking your bio on Wikipedia, and I've seen that you inspired a TV show that I loved very much. It's the show True Detective. You are one of the writers who inspired this show. In this TV series, there's one character. His name is Rust Cohle, and it's played by Matthew McConaughey. And this guy is very nihilistic, very pessimistic. He has a very grim view of the world. Keith didn't see the show, but I've sent Keith a small extract of his TV show. Maybe, Keith, can you read just the extract? Because you're far better as an actor, and my voice is shitty. So can you just read with your best actor voice that you have, deep one?
I'll read this out. I haven't seen the show yet. It's on my wish list. But after discovering about David, about the influence of your writings and philosophy on the show, I'm even more intrigued to watch it now. So here we go. So this is the extract Olivier sent me. I think human consciousness is a tragic misstep in evolution.
It was a tragic misstep in evolution. We became too self-aware. Nature created an aspect of nature separate from itself. We are creatures that should not exist by natural law.
That sounds god-fucking awful, Russ.
We are things that labor under the illusion of having a self, this accretion of sensory experience and feeling, programmed with total assurance that we are each somebody, when in fact everybody's nobody.
I wouldn't go around spouting that shit I was you. People around here don't think that way. I don't think that way.
I think the honorable thing for our species to do is deny our programming. Stop reproducing. Walk hand in hand into extinction. One last midnight. Brothers and sisters opting out of a raw deal.
Brothers and sisters opting out of a raw deal.
Bam. And our show is supposed to be humorous. So here, David, help us out. After having that, can we have fun together? What do you think?
I think we can. I think there are lots of jokes about death. There's lots of humor about... some people, by the way, interpret that as an insensitivity to death, whereas I view it as the opposite. I actually think that much humor about death emanates from our great anxiety about it. So I don't see an incompatibility between laughing about it and also taking it seriously.
Yeah.
I think that's comedy, isn't it? I mean, it's laughing at the inevitable and the ridiculousness of certain things, and even again with all this consciousness and the way we live and how seriously we take things. It's the big joke at the end of it is none of us gets out of here alive anyway.
Yeah, that part doesn't seem like the joke.
I would like to get your view about death, because there's this book, the latest book that you had, which is about the human predicament, and you talk about death. Can you tell us more about your views?
So a lot of people think that I should be embracing death and thinking death is a good thing because of my views about coming into existence. So they say, well, if you think that coming into existence is bad, then better to get out of existence as soon as possible. I don't think that implication holds. I think that we can be harmed by being brought into existence and also harmed by being taken out of existence. So I do think that death is a harm. I must say I'm less confident about that than I am about the harm of coming into existence. That is my settled view. There's some quite famous challenges to that view, the Epicurean challenge to the view that death is bad for us. And I don't pretend in that book or anywhere else to be providing a knockdown argument against the Epicureans. I don't think there is any such argument that decisively puts that Epicurean challenge to bed. But I think that if you look at the balance of considerations, we should reach the conclusion that death is in fact a harm.
You think that coming to life is a bad thing, right? It's awful, right? It's tragic. So maybe the easiest thing is basically, well, let's kill ourselves or commit suicide, but it's not what you would like to do. You know, this is not what you preach.
No, so I think never existing beings that have not come into existence have no interest in coming into existence. And if they come into existence, they're going to suffer all kinds of things they wouldn't otherwise, that they'd be spared. There'd just be a void of that suffering. So that's why I think we haven't got any interest in coming into existence. But once we do exist, we have an interest in continuing to exist. And that's the interest that is thwarted by death. The interest in avoiding suffering never overrides the interest in continuing to live. If the suffering gets bad enough, as I think it not infrequently does at the end of life, then I think that our interest in avoiding that could override our interest in continuing to live. For the majority of our lives, most of us, as long as we're in reasonably good health and no matter what other adversity we might have, it's probably in our interests, all things considered, to continue living. For now. For now, yes, because often it gets very bad towards the end. Some people just drop, but a lot of people, their death is preceded by a great deal of suffering.
In this last week, I've listened to hours and hours of interviews that you've done with other people, just trying to get a sense of where it's at. And I think you talk about this it's that balance between suffering and non-suffering, and you're coming from a place of that there is far more suffering. It's about the balance between those two. But I suppose, what would you define as suffering?
Well, I think it's not just suffering. I think that the bad things in life contain are much more than just suffering. Suffering I sometimes use as a kind of shorthand for the whole category of badness in life. Now, it does depend here on what view you take about the nature of well-being, about what constitutes well-being, how you assess how well off somebody is. And there are hedonistic views that reduce all of this to pain and pleasure. And then suffering would be another hedonistic category. It would be a kind of pain, or a broader category than pain. I don't want to arbitrarily restrict our discussion just to that. I think that there are other ways in which somebody might think a life goes badly. And I think the points that I make about the badness of life apply to those broader views as well.
Could you elaborate on that just a little bit? I think I've seen this and I know it's come up a lot in interviews that you've done previously. I suppose rather than reducing it to just suffering, non-suffering, or the hedonistic sort of principle of pain and pleasure, you use the term badness. So it's whether it's suffering or badness. Some of the arguments are going to be, well, there's the actual human spirit itself is almost part of that, is about overcoming those things, and in a weird sort of way, that's where we get growth, we get pleasure, we get a sense of fulfillment from those things. I was having a conversation with someone yesterday where I was with the sort of anti-natalist view there. I can't settle into it yet, but I was playing devil advocate and fighting your case for that.
So that's the devil's advocate, is it?
Yes.
He looks like the devil.
Maybe it's an angel's advocate.
Maybe
Ah.
to use the accepted term of the definition. But I suppose that's where the question gets into. Is it's about measurement, isn't it? How do we measure that? How do we get to a point where we're balanced and saying, well, it is all bad? There'll be many people who have had what they would see as terrible lives, and they would say, I would do it again. And I suppose your argument against that then becomes, well, that's because we're already influenced, because we're already here. So I think where I want to get to is, what is the bad that isn't worth coming into?
Well, there's lots going on in that comment of yours, and I'd like to try to unpack some of it. First of all, as I say, I don't think that everything needs to be reducible to a subjective account. So there can be bad things in a life, even if you don't experience them. This is a controversial view. Not everybody accepts this.
Mm-hmm.
You dedicated your entire life towards some goal, and 5 minutes after you died, everything was thwarted. In other words, everything you'd worked for was undone. Perhaps you'd written a fantastic manuscript and it got burnt 5 minutes after you died. All that effort would have been utterly wasted. Now, this is not something that you're going to experience yourself, but if I was making an assessment of your life, I would say, what a waste. That's an ill that has befallen you. It's befallen you posthumously, but it's had a retroactive effect on your life. A purpose your life could have had has come to naught. So that's an example of something that is bad, even if you're not aware of it. Or think about ignorance. Sometimes people are aware of their ignorance, and sometimes people are unaware of their ignorance. People who are unaware of their ignorance might not feel subjectively very badly about it at all, but it may indeed be that their ignorance is a bad thing. It might be better if they had a deeper understanding and knew more things, even if they are not suffering subjectively under the burden of this ignorance. So these are just a few examples. There are plenty others. So the way in which we might broaden the category. Now, another point that you made was about how do we weigh up the goods and the bads in life? And of course, there's no precise mechanism for doing this. There's no precise mechanism at all. And I'm not pretending that is the case. Within the restrictions that we have of precision here, or the level of precision, I think we can make broad claims. So with regard to pleasures and pains, among the observations I've made are that pleasures tend to be much more fleeting than pains are. Pains can extend for a much longer period than pleasures do. There is such a thing as chronic pain. There's no such thing as chronic pleasure. Think about the intensity of pleasure. Well, the most intense pleasures are not as intense as the worst pains are bad. These are sort of indicators that you can look at. And when you consider those sorts of things, I think you need to come to the conclusion that there's going to be more negative than positive. It has to be rough. It's not in any precise way, but we can use our reasonable tools to work out roughly where the balance lies.
We almost have to take the subjective view out of it. You're coming at from looking from the outside, and it's looking at it in an objective way.
I don't want to take the subjective part out entirely. I just think that there might be things beyond that as well that we ought to consider. At least on some views there are. So I don't want to artificially restrict my argument. I want my argument to be appealing to a wide range of views about what well-being consists in. I would certainly say that your subjective states are important, but they may not be all that's important.
An argument could be made where it's even, again, this is the ignorance argument, I suppose. If I live a life and I develop tools in which to delude myself, so whether that's adaptation or it's tricks of thinking, but if in my subject experience I'm happy, someone else might look at it objectively. It's like two people can go through the same experience and both of them come out with a different sense of that experience, and one of them might class themselves as happy and one of them as not. I suppose with the human condition as it is, if we've fallen for the illusion so completely, then our perception, in terms of our perception of reality, does that change the effective truth?
Yes, I think there is a feedback loop. So I think if you believe that things are better than they actually are, they actually become a bit better than they otherwise would be. But I don't think that your subjective assessment is decisive. I don't think that it's true just because you think it's the case. So there may be an extent to which you can have mind prevailing over reality so that your perception of the way things are can influence the way they are, but it doesn't mean that things actually become the way you think they are.
No, but I suppose your experience of them, your perceived experience of them is changed.
Yes, that's true. And that's going to have a role in how well off you are. If you've got a positive attitude, things will feel better than if you've got a negative attitude. That's true. But it doesn't follow from that things are as good as you think they are. They may be better than they otherwise would have been, but it doesn't follow that they're as good as you think they are.
Does it matter, actually, David? Because this existence is very subjective for everyone, meaning that we live our life and everything that we perceive, it's our perception. We live through filters. We have these biases. We have this brain which filters everything. So each one of us has his own unique experience. And as Kip said, is you have different point of views, but because it's just an experience, is it bad or is it good? It's just like, this is only an experience at the end of the day.
But people can be wrong. There are all kinds of experiences that people have that are non-veridical. So you look on the horizon when you're in the desert and you see water shimmering there, and it turns out it's just a mirage. So there are visual illusions, there are auditory illusions. Not everything that people experience is actually the way they think it is.
I think we agree with you that life is suffering and life can be tragic, because it's the whole Buddhist concept of life is suffering, I think, is the first noble truth or second noble truth, whatever it means. And now that we are here, living and breathing, what do we do then?
Oh, yes. So I do think we make the most of it. So once we're here, we ought to try to minimize unpleasantness, minimize badness, both in our own lives and in the lives around us. Try to make your life as meaningful as you can. Of course, it's going to be heavily constrained by the circumstances. And I don't believe that our lives could have cosmic meaning, but there are all kinds of other meaning that they could have, and we can generate that meaning. I'm fully in favor of our doing that. So that, I think, is entirely the appropriate response to our condition and our predicament.
So how do we do that? Like, how do we create this meaningful life, actually? Because it's one of our selling points here, David. We use death, to create meaning.
I think it's different for different people. So I'd be very suspicious of a single message, as it were, for everybody. It depends in part on what your talents are, what your dispositions are. Different people are going to be able to do different things. So some people are going to generate meaning through artistic creativity, and others might do it through helping impoverished people, and other people might do it producing the Death Hangout and engage in discussions that inspire people. So there are any number of things. Depends what your skill set is and what your disposition is.
Let's just say everyone adopted the antinatalism sort of approach tomorrow. And without that legacy piece, which has come up, we spoke to Sheldon Solomon about the whole death anxiety thing and how legacy can drive us on in a negative and a positive way. If we take away the fact that everything is going to end fairly soon because we've all stopped procreating, so in terms of human existence, how does that change how we go about living our lives? So yeah, we're here. I think I understand. I'm okay with that concept of, you're talking about it's about coming into being as opposed to what we do with the being now. But if we take away that future, how does that change how we live now?
Well, that would change things quite a bit. So if we knew that we were the final generation and we know further generations, that would be, I think, very upsetting for a large number of people, and it would rob a great deal of meaning from many people's lives. The point is that that's going to happen at some point anyway. We don't know how humanity will go extinct. There are a number of possibilities. One is that it happens suddenly. And if it happens suddenly, then nobody would have the sort of acute pre-extinction anxiety that this is the final generation. They might not know about it, might just get hit suddenly and the entire species dies. But there are other possibilities, and those include ones where humans gradually become extinct. They head towards extinction, perhaps because the planet becomes steadily more uninhabitable, and so people die out, and there's less procreation, and more of the children who are born are dying very young, and the human population wanes, and at some point it becomes clear that humanity will probably become extinct quite soon. And then these very problems that you've presented to me would arise at that point. So when people say to me, well, if everybody were to act on your antinatalist views, then we would generate this problem, I say, well, the problem's going to occur anyway. And all you're doing by producing future generations of children is delaying the inevitable catastrophic end. We don't know the precise form of that end, but it's going to happen, and you're just delaying things. So what we might have here is a procreational Ponzi scheme, that you're trying to have the meaning, create the meaning of future generations. So you create another generation in order to do that. But in order for them to keep themselves going, they need to produce another generation and then another generation. But eventually, as with all Ponzi schemes, this is going to go bust.
I don't think that people can hear you or can understand you, because here, this argument, which is very objective, I guess, it goes against everything that we have been told, our culture, our biology, our programming, everything pushes us to reproduce, right? So,
Correct.
but the narrative that you have, I'm not sure that it can be heard, it's very difficult. And you can come with all the arguments about extinction, which, by the way, can happen faster, as you said, because of climate change. There's also the fact that our Earth will be, I think it will be swallowed by the sun in 7 billion years, because the sun will become a red giant. And then you have the argument that even the universe, I think there's a theory that it will become cold and die at some stage. So yeah, our fate, if we look like at very far, we will disappear. But it won't stop people to procreate. It's not possible. This thought, it will be just like removed. It wouldn't exist. Nobody can hear that.
I agree, and I fully acknowledge that from the start. You were asking me to consider a hypothetical scenario. I'm not suggesting for a moment it's the actual scenario that everybody's going to hear this argument and then stop procreating. We were considering a purely hypothetical scenario that if everybody were to act on my view, then there would be no future generation. And then you asked me to consider what would that be like.
I suppose then a question that leads from that is, it's in terms of spreading, sharing the anti-natalist view, what's the end game?
Well, it's, again, a lot of people have this view that it's all or nothing. You must either convince everybody or it's no point at all. I suppose I'm doing two things. First of all, I'm just expressing what I take to be the correct view on this matter, that to bring a child into existence is a monumentally bad thing to do because of all the harm that you inflict on that being and indirectly on the beings that being will in turn produce. It's to make an argument of that kind. And then secondly, if there are some people who are convinced by that argument, and there are some who will be amenable to this, even if most people just can't hear it, they can't internalize it. There are some who find this amenable. They will not reproduce. And every child that is not produced is a child that is spared all the suffering of a life and is spared death.
I actually know someone who that was in a relationship with someone for a long period of time, and they ended up separating because of that very thing. I hadn't heard of antinatalism at this point, I'm talking over a decade ago. But his view was that exactly what you're saying is like he didn't want to bring someone into the world. He didn't think it was right. So, and his partner wanted to have kids. So that was but it's interesting hearing it now because I get a flashback to that person. And I suppose what you're saying there is it's not about all or nothing. It's not about everyone. But you think even with some people taking it on board, there is a benefit.
Yes. So think about a doctor who is trying to save lives, let's say. That doctor is not going to save the life of everybody on earth, every sick person on earth. But you don't think that because you can't save everybody, you ought to save nobody. So the doctor can do some good within the restricted realm. And similarly, if one advances an argument that might spare people suffering and spare death, then that's a good thing, even if only some people are going to act on it.
I suppose if the person doesn't come into existence, who gets the benefit?
There is no particular person who gets the benefit, but the absence of that bad is a good thing. We look at the two possible scenarios where that child would have come into existence and where it doesn't come into existence. We can plausibly say that the scenario where they don't come into existence is better because there is nobody suffering those harms.
I was thinking, and maybe I'm still not getting it, but I was thinking right now at, the top 5 regrets of the dying. Do you know this one? The top 5 regrets of the dying? It's a nurse called Bronnie Ware who wrote this book based on she has seen like hundreds and hundreds of hospice people dying on their deathbed. And she noticed that there was like 5 common themes out of all these people dying. They were all have common regrets. All of them, they never said, I wish I'd never been born. They all said, I wish I hadn't worked so much. I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, all this life. But nobody regretted this life, really. Everyone were happy to be there.
Well, that comes back to Keith's point. He made that point earlier as well, that many people say they would do it all over again. And my view is that people just are not considering the counterfactual. They're not considering the alternative scenario where they had not existed. So that view that you do it all over again, I think that's a kind of coping mechanism with this very unfortunate reality that it would have really been better if we'd never come into existence.
I think on the sort of from a logical or philosophical sort of level, I can sort of understand it. We can't judge this argument based through the lens which we look at now, because it's already filtered with the biological imperative is already strong to do that. I suppose the question that's coming up for me is, what would it take, what change would have to happen with humanity and how we lived to make you change your view on your argument?
I don't think that anything that could actually happen would lead me to change my view. I could tell you in principle. So if lives would be utterly devoid of unpleasantness and they were filled with pleasantness, then I'd say wouldn't be a harm to come into existence.
It's an interesting. It's a bit like in the film The Matrix. That whole concept of the AI develops the dreamlike state that humans go in, and when everything was perfect, they rejected it.
I'm not familiar with the film, so I don't know.
Yeah,
what goes on.
Yeah, that was the concept in the film. Was just very, very quickly. It's AI takes over, and it basically breeds people to use as energy. And to keep them sort of alive and producing this energy, it puts them into this dreamlike state. And they went through various versions of it. And they found that the one that worked was one where there was a certain amount of suffering or challenge. When they created the perfect world for them, because they thought that's what people would want, they actually rejected it. It's almost like they couldn't deal with that sort of perfect state. And I think this comes back to the argument of the human spirit and what it's about.
That sounds like a Hollywood moralizing to me, because obviously they didn't create the perfect being then. If it really had been perfect, then they could have given fantastic quality of life without people not appreciating that. In other words, the perfect life could have actually been pleasing. In the Matrix, in this idea, since it's all artificial, as I understand it, you don't have any depth here. This is just subjective experience. There's nothing beyond that.
Yeah, it's all subjective. It's
Don't you think, like, and again, this is my human lens again, because I am in this body with my biology and all this, and I'm obviously resisting your idea as much as possible, but I'm trying to embrace it at the same time. I'm making lots of paper, believe me. Don't you think that it will get boring? If it was only pleasant and pleasant, and when you said before, you said there's no excruciating pleasure. Well, there is, if you try psychedelic drugs, I can tell you there is excruciating pleasure with excruciating pain at the same time, whatever. But there's the pain and the pleasure at the same time that gives you something as well. There's good to that as well. But that's my view with my filters and my biology and all these things. But I don't know. I was throwing this to you as well, David.
I suppose that's where what Olivia was saying about people not hearing your approach, David, and it is that whole. It's hard. It's hard for people to look at this argument without looking through the lens that's there, and I think there's something within, again, humans. It's that element of hope. I think that's what's probably devoid completely from your argument, is a concept of hope. And I think that you talked about people where maybe the suffering does get too bad, maybe people who suffer but unfortunately bad enough that they do commit suicide. It's that complete absence of hope that disappears.
But this is a recurring theme, I think, in your comments, this idea of hope and growth and developing as a result of adversity. Yeah. And I don't deny those phenomena at all. I recognize that people can grow through adversity. That benefit is a benefit to somebody who already exists. But if you had not had that adversity and not had that growth because the person had never come into existence, then there would be nobody who had been deprived of that. It would not be, the absence of that good would not be bad. So in other words, the growth is good given the adversity, because at least something good comes out of the adversity. But that's not good. A warrant for the adversity in the first place. Think about other cases where somebody already exists. So let's imagine, I don't know, you live far apart, but perhaps from time to time you meet up with one another, and you're very friendly across the internet. Let's imagine in person, one of you assaults the other one very badly.
It happened.
Sorry to hear that. But let's imagine one of you insulted the other one very badly, and the assaulted one, the victim, went through some growth as a result of that. And that was actually your goal. The assaulter's goal was to produce this growth. But I don't think that would justify the assault in the first place. Something might good come from the assault, but doesn't mean to say you warranted in assaulting somebody else. And ditto with creating a person. If you're going to create a person and you know they're going to face adversity, and you say, well, at least something good will come of it, that's not an excuse to create them, because the absence of that good would not be bad if they had not come into existence.